Have you ever felt like the person everyone expects you to be isn't actually you? Like, you got handed a role in junior high or in your first job, and you've been playing it ever since, even though it stopped fitting years ago. That feeling, that's exactly where Law 25 begins. Here's the core idea. Most people accept the identity that family, school, and early jobs hand them. They get labeled the quiet one, or the reliable one, or the funny one, and they spend the next 20 years performing that label instead of living. Law 25 says something almost rebellious. You are allowed to write your own character. Not once, over and over, whenever the old version stops serving you. And here's the part most people miss. The world doesn't actually require your permission to do this. It only feels that way because we mistake other people's memory of us for some kind of binding contract. Let me tell you about Madonna. Not the music, the method. In the early 80s, she was a scrappy dance club performer in New York, broke, sleeping on friends' floors. She built a persona, bold, sexual, provocative, and the world ate it up. But here's what's interesting. The moment that persona started to feel like a cage, she didn't cling to it. She tore it down and built another one. The conical bra and material girl era gave way to the spiritual seeker and ray of light. Then the cowboy hat and line dancing of music. Then the electro-futurist. Each time, critics said she was finished, and each time she simply became someone new on her own schedule before the public got bored first. Notice what she never did, though. She never apologized for the change, and she never tried to convince anyone the old version had been a mistake. She just stopped performing it and started performing the next one, with full conviction, as if it had always been the plan. That confidence is half the trick. A reinvention announced with doubt reads as a crisis. A reinvention announced with certainty reads as growth. Why did that work? Because she understood something most of us resist. Identity is not a fixed truth you discover once. It's a costume you choose, and you can choose again. The audience didn't lose interest in Madonna. They lost interest in repetition. The person who reinvents stays the main character. The person who stays static becomes furniture. The comfortable, predictable thing nobody bothers looking at twice. And you can do the same thing, because the muscle isn't talent, it's permission. Permission to stop explaining your past self to people who only knew an old version of you. Permission to let an outdated reputation simply expire instead of fighting to either defend it or apologize for it. What part of your current identity did you actually choose, and what part did you just inherit? Hold on to that question, because the next law is about something almost the opposite of self-expression. It's about staying invisible. Let's go to Law 26. Keep your hands clean. Have you ever made a tough call at work? The layoff, the rejection, the hard truth, and watched your reputation take the hit for months afterward, even though it was the right decision? That sting, that's the exact problem Law 26 is built to solve. The principle is simple and a little cold. The people who stay powerful longest are rarely the ones doing the dirty work directly. They find instruments, other people, other systems, to carry out the unpopular parts, while they keep their own image spotless. It's not that the dirty work disappears, it just gets attached to a different name. Picture Henry VIII of England. When he wanted to break from the Catholic Church, seize monastery wealth, and execute inconvenient nobles, he didn't personally swing the axe of public opinion. He had Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell drafted the laws, dissolved the monasteries, hunted down dissenters, and absorbed the resentment of an entire nation. For years it worked beautifully. Henry got everything he wanted, while Cromwell got the blame. Cromwell understood the arrangement, by the way. He wasn't a naive pawn. He was making himself indispensable, betting that proximity to the king's favor was worth the public hatred. For a while, that bet paid off spectacularly. He rose from a blacksmith's son to one of the most powerful men in England. And then, when the public's anger boiled over and Henry needed to look merciful again, who do you think he sacrificed? He had Cromwell arrested and executed on fabricated charges of treason and heresy. And just like that, the king's hands were clean again. The architect of the king's will became the king's alibi. The very usefulness that made Cromwell so valuable is what made him so disposable. He knew where every body was buried, which meant he was also the easiest, most convenient place to bury the blame. That's brutal, I know. You don't have to throw anyone under a bus to use this law. The everyday version looks like this: a manager who lets a difficult policy come from corporate instead of personally delivering it. Or a founder who has a co-founder deliver the layoff news while she focuses on the comeback plan. The lesson isn't betray people. The lesson is notice how much of your reputation gets spent on tasks that didn't need your fingerprints on them at all. And notice how often the most loyal, useful people around you are quietly absorbing reputational cost on your behalf without you ever asking them to. There's a limit to this game worth naming honestly, though. Use the same scapegoat too many times, and people start noticing the pattern. Cromwell's own allies eventually saw exactly what he was for the king, which is part of why so few of them rushed to defend him when the axe finally fell. The tool only stays useful as long as it doesn't look like a tool. Ask yourself this: which of your current headaches are actually yours to carry personally? And which ones are you carrying out of habit, not necessity? Because staying clean only gets you halfway. The next law is about something far more powerful than reputation. It's about belief itself. Onward to Law 27. Play on people's need to believe. Have you ever watched a brand, a leader, or even a friend's startup pitch and thought, why does everyone around me treat this like a religion? Why are they not just buying a product, they're buying an identity? That's Law 27 in action, and it's one of the most quietly powerful forces in human behavior. Here's the theory underneath it. People don't just want information, they want meaning. They want to belong to something larger than their own small, uncertain lives. And whoever offers that feeling of belonging, mystery, and shared purpose earns a devotion that facts alone never could. This is also why pure logic so often loses to a compelling story. A spreadsheet doesn't give anyone goosebumps, but a sense of mission does. Think about Steve Jobs returning to Apple in 1997. The company was nearly bankrupt, and on paper it sold computers, a commodity. But Jobs didn't sell computers. He sold a worldview. Think different. Rebel against conformity. Join the creative misfits against the beige corporate machine. He staged keynote events like religious revivals with a single chosen object lit dramatically on a black stage and a devoted crowd that gasped and cheered before a single feature was even explained. People camped overnight outside stores. They got the logo tattooed on their skin. Why? Because Jobs wasn't asking them to evaluate specs. He was inviting them into an identity, a tribe, a feeling of being one of the people who get it, who saw the future before everyone else caught on. Notice the ingredients that made this work, because they're consistent across every cult-like following in history, from religious movements to fan bases to political campaigns. There's an enemy or an old order to rebel against. For Apple, it was the man in the gray flannel suit. There's a sense of secret, superior insight available only to believers. And there's ritual, the launch event, the unboxing, the line outside the store that turns private belief into a shared public experience. Strip out any one of those three ingredients, and the whole effect weakens considerably. That's the mechanism. Vague aspirational language plus visible communal ritual creates belief faster than any spreadsheet of features ever could. And once people believe, they stop asking questions. Believers don't fact-check, they defend, often more fiercely than the founder himself would. Now, here's the honest caveat. You have to use this with restraint, because manufactured belief can curdle into outright manipulation, and that's a line worth respecting. But the underlying skill, speaking to identity and belonging, not just utility, is something every leader, every creator, every person trying to build a following needs to understand. So here's the question worth sitting with. When you describe your own work to other people, are you describing a feature or are you describing a feeling they get to belong to? Belief gets people in the door, but the next law is about what happens once you're standing at the threshold and have to actually move. Law 28, enter action with boldness. Have you ever stood at the edge of a big decision, quitting the job, sending the message, making the offer, and felt your own hesitation leak out into your voice, your posture, your whole presence? People can smell that hesitation, and that's exactly the trap Law 28 warns you about. The core idea is uncomfortable, but true. Timidity is not safer than boldness. It's actually more dangerous, because half measures advertise your own doubt to everyone watching, and doubt invites attack. If you're going to act like you've already decided it will work. Hesitation rarely buys you safety. It usually just buys you a slower, more visible failure, because everyone watching gets time to notice you wavering and adjust against you. There's no better illustration of this than Julius Caesar at the Rubicon River in 49 BC. Roman law was unambiguous. A general was forbidden from bringing his army across that river into Italy. Doing so was treason, an irreversible declaration of civil war against the Senate itself. Caesar stood on that riverbank with everything to lose. He could have waited for more support, negotiated longer, hedged his position the way most cautious leaders would have. Instead, according to the historians who recorded the moment, he is said to have uttered words to the effect that the decision was now made, and there could be no turning back, and he marched his legions across. What's easy to miss in that story is that Caesar's actual military position wasn't overwhelming at the moment he crossed. He had one legion with him, far from his full strength. A purely rational calculation of his odds might have argued for more patience. But Caesar understood something his rivals didn't, that the psychological shock of total, irreversible commitment is itself a weapon, often more decisive than raw numbers. That single, fully committed act changed everything. His enemies, who had been counting on him to stay cautious and divided, were thrown into confusion. Several cities that might have resisted a hesitant Caesar instead surrendered to a man who clearly believed he'd already won. Boldness didn't just start the war, it won the opening moves of the war before a single sword was drawn, purely through the psychological shock of total commitment, while his rivals were still debating their own next move. You don't need a river or an army to feel this. Think about the last time you watched someone walk into a room and own it, versus someone who shuffled in apologizing for existing. Confidence isn't a personality trait. It's a decision you broadcast with your body before your mouth even opens. And people read that broadcast faster than they read anything you actually say. So ask yourself, where in your life right now are you doing something at half speed, hoping nobody notices the hesitation? Because they notice. Boldness gets you moving, but moving without a destination is just noise, which is why the very next law takes us from action all the way out to the end game. Let's go to Law 29. Plan all the way to the end. Have you ever won a small battle? got the promotion, closed the deal, won the argument, and then watched the whole thing fall apart 6 months later because you hadn't thought past the celebration? That gap between winning a moment and winning a future is exactly what Law 29 addresses. The principle here is patience with vision. Most people plan as far as the next obstacle. Powerful people plan as far as the final outcome, years out, and they're willing to accept short-term discomfort because they can already see the shape of where it's all heading. This requires a kind of emotional discipline most of us never practice, the willingness to look weaker, slower, or less impressive in year 1 because you already know what year 10 is supposed to look like. John D. Rockefeller is a striking case. In the early days of Standard Oil, refining was a chaotic boom-and-bust business. Dozens of small refiners drilling and competing themselves into bankruptcy with wild, undisciplined price wars. Rockefeller didn't just want to win this year's price war. He was already imagining an oil industry that didn't exist yet. One single, vertically integrated machine controlling extraction, refining, transport, and sale, with him at the center. So instead of simply out-competing rivals on price, which would only win him this quarter, he spent years quietly buying pipelines, negotiating secret rebates with railroads, and acquiring competitors one by one, even when it meant slower, less flashy growth than a more aggressive rival might have shown on paper. What's remarkable is how unglamorous most of those individual moves looked at the time. Buying a single small refinery in Cleveland wasn't a headline. Negotiating a marginally better shipping rate wasn't exciting. None of it would have impressed anyone looking for a dramatic story of business conquest. But Rockefeller wasn't optimizing for an impressive story this year. He was optimizing for inevitability 20 years out. By the time competitors realized what was happening, he wasn't competing with them anymore. He basically was the market. And the very forgettable, patient moves that built that position were exactly what made it nearly impossible to dislodge once people finally noticed. That's the heart of this law. Short-term thinkers chase the next win. Long-term thinkers sacrifice the next win if it sets up the win after that, and the one after that, even when nobody around them understands why they're playing it so slow. There's a trap on the other side of this law, too, worth being honest about. Some people use plan all the way to the end as an excuse for endless analysis, refusing to commit to anything until every contingency feels accounted for. Rockefeller's patience worked because he was still buying, still negotiating, still moving every single week. The long game only stays a strategy as long as it includes real ongoing motion. The moment patience turns into paralysis, you're not playing the long game anymore. You're just stalling and calling it wisdom. Here's a question to sit with. The decision you're most proud of this month, does it actually move you toward where you want to be in 5 years? Or does it just feel good today? Planning the whole arc matters, but there's a strange twist to power. Sometimes the most impressive thing isn't the plan itself. It's making all that planning invisible. Onward to Law 30. Make your accomplishments seem effortless. Have you ever watched someone deliver a flawless presentation, an effortless joke, a perfect golf swing, and felt a pang of something between admiration and resentment? That reaction is exactly why Law 30 matters. The way you reveal your effort changes how people experience your talent. Here's the principle. When people see the sweat, the struggle, the 18 drafts, it humanizes you, sure, but it also makes your success feel ordinary, replicable, something anyone could manage with enough grinding. When they only see the final, polished result, your success feels like magic, and people don't compete with magic. They admire it from a respectful distance without ever feeling the urge to tear it down. Cary Grant is the textbook example. On screen, he was the definition of effortless charm, the perfectly timed line, the elegant stumble that somehow looked graceful, the tuxedo that seemed to wear itself. What audiences never saw was the years of brutal vaudeville and acrobatics training he went through as a young performer named Archie Leach, tumbling and falling on stages across England and America to learn precise physical timing down to the inch, often performing multiple shows a day for audiences who had no idea who he'd one day become. By the time he became Cary Grant, all of that labor had been absorbed into his body so completely that none of it showed. It's worth pausing on just how deliberate that disappearance was. Grant reportedly studied his own performances obsessively, refining tiny physical details, the precise angle of a head turn, the exact pause before a punchline, until they looked completely natural rather than rehearsed. The paradox is that achieving effortless actually required enormous invisible effort specifically aimed at hiding itself. Audiences just saw ease, and ease on screen reads as star power, not luck, not chance, but a kind of effortless command over the world that the actual sweat would have undermined. This is why a chef plates a dish that took 4 hours to prepare in 30 seconds of presentation. Why a singer never lets you see her practicing the same phrase 200 times. And why a polished public speaker never mentions how many times she rehearsed in front of a mirror the night before. The work is real. The performance of ease is also real. It's just a separate skill, one most people never bother developing because they assume showing the effort is automatically a virtue. There's a real cost to hiding your effort completely too, and it's worth naming. Grant could afford total invisibility because Hollywood eventually rewarded him with fame regardless of who saw the work. In a workplace, complete invisibility can mean nobody on the promotion committee ever learns what it actually took to get the result, and credit quietly drifts to whoever talked about their effort the loudest. The skill isn't hiding effort everywhere. It's choosing carefully which audiences need to see the seams and which ones only need to see the finished, effortless version. So here's a question for you. The next time you finish something hard, do you lead with, "This was so much work?" Or do you let the result speak first? Effortlessness impresses people, but sometimes power isn't about impressing them at all. It's about quietly steering the choices in front of them. Let's move to Law 31. Control the options. Have you ever walked away from a negotiation feeling like you'd made a free choice, only to realize later that every option on the table had actually been designed to lead you to the same place? That uneasy realization is the whole point of Law 31. The idea is this: real control rarely looks like control. It looks like generosity. The most skillful operators don't force you into a single outcome. They hand you 2 or 3 choices, all of which quietly serve their interests and let you feel the satisfaction of choosing for yourself. This works because of a quirk in human psychology. We trust decisions we feel we generated far more than decisions handed to us outright, even when the actual range of outcomes was identical either way. I think about a friend of mine who managed a small creative team. Whenever someone wanted to push back on a deadline or a project direction, she never said no. She'd say, "Sure, we could push the deadline 2 weeks, but then we'd lose the launch slot we fought for. Or we could keep the date and I can pull in extra help for the next 5 days. Both options technically existed, but she already knew which one any reasonable person would pick because she'd built the second option to be obviously more attractive. Her team left every single one of those conversations feeling heard, feeling like they'd made the call, and she got the outcome she wanted nearly every time. What made her especially skilled at this was that she never presented an option she'd actually be unhappy with. every choice on her table had already been pre-approved by her own interests before it ever reached the conversation. The team experienced freedom. She experienced near-total predictability of outcome. That's the real trick. It isn't deception exactly, since both options were genuinely real and genuinely available. It's that the menu itself was curated long before anyone sat down to order from it. That's the craft of this law. You're not eliminating someone's freedom. You're curating the menu before they ever sit down at the table. People defend choices they feel they made. They resist choices that feel forced on them. So the highest leverage move is often not persuasion at all. It's quietly deciding what the available options even are, well before the conversation starts. There's a fragile line in this law that's worth respecting, though. The entire trick depends on the other person never sensing that the menu was curated. The instant someone feels like every choice you offer is secretly rigged in your favor, the trust evaporates completely, and they stop engaging with your options at all. They start looking for a way out of the conversation entirely. The skill only works when the options are genuinely real, not just dressed-up versions of the same outcome. Ask yourself, the last time you felt sure you'd made an independent decision, who set the menu in front of you? Controlling the options works on logic and convenience, but there's a deeper lever still, and it doesn't run through logic at all. It runs through imagination. Let's go to Law 32. Play to people's fantasies. Have you ever noticed that the products and places people love most rarely sell you reality? They sell you an escape from it. That's the entire engine behind Law 32. People don't act on cold truth nearly as often as they act on a story they want to believe about their own lives. The principle is straightforward once you see it. Reality is often dull, limiting, and unglamorous. Fantasy is boundless. Whoever can hand someone a vivid, emotionally satisfying fantasy and let them briefly live inside it earns a loyalty that facts simply can't compete with. This is precisely why dry, accurate descriptions so often lose to vague, glowing promises, even among smart, skeptical people who should logically know better. Walt Disney understood this better than almost anyone in modern history. In the 1950s, amusement parks were considered seedy, low-rent affairs. Broken-down rides, carnival hustlers, dirty walkways nobody wanted to bring a family to. Disney looked at that landscape and built the exact opposite. He created Disneyland as a complete, immersive fantasy, Main Street, USA, designed to evoke a nostalgic, idealized small-town childhood that most visitors never actually had. Tomorrowland selling a gleaming, optimistic future. Every employee trained to stay in character and never break the illusion, even down to underground tunnels so guests would never see a costumed character walking between two completely different fictional worlds. The level of obsession with maintaining that fantasy is what separated Disney from every cheap imitation that followed. Trash had to be collected so frequently that guests almost never saw it accumulate. Employees were trained never to say, "I don't know," but instead to direct guests to someone who could help, preserving the sense that the entire world inside the gates was competent and complete. None of that was about rides or mechanics. It was about protecting an illusion so thoroughly that visitors could fully surrender to it without their disbelief ever creeping back in. He wasn't selling rides. He was selling a few hours inside someone else's nostalgia and someone else's dream of the future. And people would drive hundreds of miles and pay a week's wages for that feeling, returning year after year, not for the mechanical thrills, which were honestly fairly modest by later standards, but for the fantasy itself. That's the lesson for anyone building something today. A brand, a pitch, a piece of art. People aren't buying your specifications. They're buying the version of themselves they get to imagine being while using what you've made. There's a danger lurking inside this law too. A fantasy that diverges too sharply from what you can actually deliver creates a debt that eventually comes due. Disney's later struggles partly trace back to moments when the gap between the promised magic and the underlying reality grew visible to guests. And disillusionment hits far harder than ordinary disappointment ever could, precisely because the fantasy had asked them to believe so completely. The fantasy has to stay tethered, just loosely enough, to something you can keep honoring. So ask yourself, what fantasy does your work let someone else step into, even for just a moment? Fantasy opens the door to people's hearts, but to really move them, you need something more precise. You need to know exactly where they're vulnerable. That brings us to Law 33. Discover each man's thumbscrew. Have you ever tried to convince someone with airtight logic, watched them nod politely, and then watched them do absolutely nothing you asked? That frustrating experience is exactly why Law 33 exists. Logic rarely moves people. Their own private fears, insecurities, and cravings move them. And the people who learn to find those levers gain influence that arguments alone never could. The principle is this: every person carries some specific emotional weak point, a need for approval, a fear of being seen as stupid, a craving for status, a wound from childhood that never healed. Find that point, and you don't need to persuade someone with 30 reasons. You only need one, aimed exactly right. Most people spend their whole lives never realizing how transparent their own fear actually is to anyone willing to pay attention. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI for nearly 5 decades, and a huge part of how he maintained that power had little to do with crime fighting and everything to do with information. He was famous for keeping detailed personal files on politicians, journalists, and even presidents, not necessarily evidence of crimes, but evidence of vulnerabilities, affairs, addictions, financial troubles, secret insecurities. He rarely had to threaten anyone outright. The mere fact that powerful people knew Hoover possibly knew their thumbscrew was often enough to keep them deferential, cautious, unwilling to challenge him even when they technically outranked him on paper. What made this so effective wasn't even the information itself half the time, it was the uncertainty. Officials who weren't entirely sure what Hoover actually had on them tended to behave just as cautiously as the ones who knew for certain, because the mere possibility of exposure did most of the controlling work on its own. Several presidents who personally found Hoover difficult, even distasteful, nonetheless kept reappointing him year after year, decade after decade, rather than risk whatever consequences might follow from removing him. You don't need a secret filing cabinet to use this law well, though. And frankly, the dossier version of it is closer to coercion than craft. The everyday, healthier version looks like genuine attentiveness, noticing that a colleague who resists every new idea isn't being difficult. He's terrified of looking incompetent in front of the team, so you frame the idea as building on his work rather than replacing it. Noticing that a client who haggles over every dollar isn't cheap, she's anxious about being taken advantage of, so you over-communicate transparency before you even discuss price. The same underlying skill, reading what someone's actually protecting, works just as well used gently as it does used ruthlessly. So here's a question. Think of the person in your life who's hardest to influence. What are they actually afraid of underneath the resistance? Finding someone's thumbscrew gives you leverage in private, but there's a way to make people defer to you before a conversation even starts, through how you carry yourself. Let's move to Law 34. Be royal in your own fashion. Have you ever met someone with an ordinary job title who somehow commanded a room like a CEO just by the way they walked in and sat down? That's not an accident, and it's not really about confidence in the vague self-help sense. It's Law 34, the discipline of carrying yourself with the bearing of someone important regardless of what your actual rank says. The principle is almost circular, but it's true. People treat you the way you present yourself as deserving to be treated. Slouch, apologize for taking up space, fill every silence with nervous chatter, and people will unconsciously rank you lower. Move with calm, unhurried deliberateness, and people assume there must be a reason for it. They fill in the gap in their knowledge of you with an assumption of competence, simply because your bearing leaves no other obvious explanation. Coco Chanel is a remarkable example. She began life in genuine poverty, raised partly in an orphanage after her mother's death, with no money, no family name, no social standing whatsoever in early 20th century France. By any objective measure, she had zero claim to royalty. And yet, by every account from people who met her, she carried herself with an almost regal stillness and certainty. Measured speech, unhurried movement, and unwillingness to perform eagerness for anyone's approval. She designed clothing that mirrored that same philosophy, understated, confident, free of the desperate ornamentation other designers used, as if the clothes themselves refused to beg for attention the way most fashion of her era did. It's worth noting how deliberately she maintained that bearing, even at moments when her actual financial position was shaky. Early in her business, she was far from secure, frequently dependent on wealthy patrons to fund her ambitions. But she never let her clients sense that dependence. She negotiated, dressed, and spoke as though she were doing them the favor, not the other way around. Wealthy, aristocratic clients who could have looked down on her humble origins instead found themselves slightly intimidated by her composure and deferred to her taste rather than dictating to her. She essentially willed her own status into existence through bearing alone, years before her business success caught up to match it. This isn't about arrogance. Arrogance is loud and needs an audience. Royal bearing is quiet. It doesn't need anyone's permission to feel legitimate, and it certainly doesn't need anyone's approval to keep functioning the next morning. There's a hollow version of this law worth avoiding, though. Bearing without anything underneath it eventually gets exposed as pure performance. Chanel's composure worked because it was backed by genuinely exceptional taste and relentless work ethic, not bluff alone. Carry yourself like royalty while delivering nothing of substance, and people eventually stop deferring and start resenting the act instead. So here's something to notice this week. In your next meeting, are you moving and speaking like someone who belongs in that room, or like someone hoping not to get noticed as a fraud? Bearing earns you respect in the moment, but real mastery also requires knowing exactly when to use that respect, and when to simply wait. That's Law 35. Master the art of timing. Have you ever had the right idea, set it to the right person, and watched it land completely flat, only to see someone else say almost the same thing 6 months later and get celebrated for it? That's not bad luck. That's usually a timing failure, and it's exactly what Law 35 is about. The principle here is patience as a weapon, not a weakness. Power doesn't just belong to people who act, it belongs to people who know precisely when to act, and who can sit calmly through the in-between moments without panicking into premature movement. The hardest part of this law isn't recognizing the right moment when it finally shows up. It's surviving the long, uncertain stretch of waiting beforehand without convincing yourself you've been forgotten. Charles de Gaulle is one of history's great masters of timing. After leading the Free French resistance during the Second World War and becoming a national hero, he resigned from politics in 1946 when French political life turned into chaotic, fractured infighting that he had no interest in managing. For 12 years, he essentially disappeared from public life, writing his memoirs in quiet retirement while one unstable government after another rose and collapsed in Paris. Many assumed his political life was simply over, a relic of wartime glory with no place in the messy peacetime politics that followed. But that long absence wasn't passive waiting. It was strategic positioning disguised as retirement. Every year he stayed away, his image grew less tangled in the small, exhausting compromises of ordinary politics and more associated purely with strength, unity, and dignity. By 1958, when France faced a genuine constitutional crisis over the Algerian War and the existing government had lost all credibility, de Gaulle re-emerged at exactly the moment the nation was desperate for stability, and exactly the moment when his absence had transformed him from yesterday's politician into a figure who seemed above the mess entirely. He was practically begged to return and lead, on his own terms, with a new constitution designed largely around his vision. 12 years of stillness had done more for his power than 12 years of frantic activity ever could have. The lesson isn't wait forever. It's that timing has its own intelligence, separate from effort. Sometimes the smartest move available to you is simply not moving yet, even when every impatient instinct in your body is screaming otherwise. There's a risk on the far side of patience too, and it's worth naming honestly. Wait too long and the world stops wondering where you went and simply moves on without you. De Gaulle's 12 years worked because France's crisis arrived before the public's memory of him faded entirely. Patience that outlasts the opportunity itself isn't mastery anymore, it's just absence. So ask yourself, is there something you're rushing right now that would actually land with 10 times the impact if you simply let the moment ripen first? Patience is powerful, but there's a related skill that's almost the mirror image of patience, the art of wanting nothing at all. Let's go to Law 36, disdain things you cannot have. Have you ever watched someone chase a job, a relationship, or a deal so visibly hard that their desperation alone pushed it further out of reach? That painful spiral is exactly the trap Law 36 helps you avoid. The less you can have something, the more power you give it over you, unless you consciously refuse to play along. The principle is counterintuitive. Showing that something doesn't matter to you, even when it does, protects your power. Obsessing over what you've lost or what you can't get drains your energy and broadcasts weakness, while indifference, real or performed, signals that you're untouched, unbothered, still fully in control of your own life. Desire, when it's visible, is information you're handing the other side for free. Queen Elizabeth I of England turned this into a decades-long political art form. For most of her reign, dozens of suitors, princes, dukes, foreign kings pursued marriage with her, each alliance promising enormous diplomatic advantage to whichever country won her hand. Elizabeth never said a firm yes, and crucially, she never seemed desperate for any of it either. She kept negotiations dangling for years, sometimes flirted, sometimes encouraged just enough hope to keep multiple foreign powers competing for her favor. But she never let herself appear to need any single match. What made this especially impressive is that the pressure on her to marry was enormous, constant, and came from nearly everyone around her. Advisors, parliament, foreign ambassadors, all pushing for a decision. A weaker monarch would have folded under that pressure just to make the noise stop. Elizabeth instead treated the entire question with a kind of regal indifference, as though the decision belonged entirely to her own timeline and nobody else's urgency could touch it. The moment a country guessed she desperately needed their alliance, her leverage in that relationship would have evaporated instantly. By appearing entirely self-sufficient, uninterested in being possessed by any one crown, she kept nearly all of Europe courting England's favor for over 40 years, without ever surrendering her independence to a husband at all. You can see the small, everyday version of this everywhere. The job candidate who seems mildly interested rather than desperate gets the better offer. The person who can walk away from a negotiation calmly almost always gets better terms than the person who can't hide how badly they need the deal to close. There's a cost to this law too, worth being honest about. Performed indifference can slide into real neglect if you're not careful. Elizabeth's strategy worked for diplomacy precisely because she stayed genuinely engaged behind the scenes, even while appearing publicly unmoved. Disdain that becomes actual disconnection from the people and things you need eventually leaves you isolated rather than powerful. So here's the honest question. What are you currently chasing so visibly that your wanting it has become the very reason it keeps slipping away? Disdain protects your power quietly, but sometimes power needs to be loud, visible, undeniable. That's where we go next. Law 37. Create compelling spectacles. Have you ever noticed how a single dramatic image can move more people than 100 pages of careful explanation? That's exactly the force Law 37 is built on. People remember spectacle. They forget paragraphs. The principle is this. Humans respond to vivid, sensory, emotional experiences far more powerfully than they respond to abstract reasoning. If you want to be remembered, talked about, and followed, you can't just be correct, you have to be visible in a way that sticks in someone's imagination. A perfectly reasonable argument delivered flatly often loses to a half-reasonable idea delivered as an unforgettable moment. P.T. Barnum is the obvious master of this craft. When he ran his American Museum in New York in the mid-1800s, he wasn't just running an exhibit hall. He was engineering moments people couldn't stop talking about. He'd announce some outlandish curiosity, build weeks of anticipation through newspaper teasers and posters, and stage the unveiling like a theatrical event rather than a simple transaction. He understood the experience of anticipation, crowd energy, and dramatic reveal mattered just as much as whatever was actually being shown. Part of his genius was recognizing that the spectacle didn't even need to fully live up to the build-up, because by the time people actually arrived, they'd already invested so much anticipation and so much social energy, telling friends, debating with neighbors, arguing about whether the claims could possibly be true, that the experience of being there, surrounded by an excited crowd, became the real product. People didn't just come to see an exhibit, they came to be part of an event, something they could go home and describe breathlessly to their neighbors. That word of mouth, generated by spectacle rather than substance alone, is what built an empire out of curiosities that, examined coldly on their own, were often fairly modest. This applies far beyond circuses. A product launch staged like theater, a wedding proposal designed around one unforgettable image rather than a quiet conversation, a presentation that opens with a startling visual instead of a bullet point. The information might be identical in both versions, but only one of them gets remembered, retold, and shared at dinner tables weeks later. There's a ceiling on this law worth respecting, though. Spectacle without anything real underneath it eventually exhausts an audience. Barnum himself faced this when a few of his more outlandish claims were debunked, and the backlash, while real, never fully erased his legacy because enough of what he offered genuinely delivered.
Stage 1 empty spectacle too many, and people stop showing up for the next one. So ask yourself, the next time you need people to actually remember what you're telling them, are you explaining it or are you staging it? Spectacle gets you noticed, but once you're being watched closely, a different skill becomes essential: knowing when to blend in instead of stand out. Let's go to Law 38. Think as you like, but behave like others. Have you ever held a genuinely unconventional opinion at work? Said it too loudly, too early, and watched the room quietly close ranks against you? Not because you were wrong, but because you broke the social fabric. That painful lesson is exactly what Law 38 tries to spare you from. The principle is a kind of protective camouflage. You are completely free to think whatever you want privately, but broadcasting how different you are from the people around you, especially before you've earned trust or power, makes you a target rather than a leader. Difference reads as a threat to group cohesion long before it reads as insight, and groups punish perceived threats long before they get around to evaluating whether the threat was actually correct. I think about a young analyst I once heard about, early in her career at a fairly traditional finance firm, who privately believed the entire industry's approach to risk was outdated and, frankly, a little absurd. In her first few months, she said so, openly, in meetings to people 20 years her senior. She wasn't wrong, exactly, but she was instantly labeled arrogant, naive, not a team player, and her ideas got quietly filtered out of every conversation that mattered, regardless of their merit. A colleague who joined around the same time held nearly identical private opinions about the firm's flaws, but spent 2 years simply doing excellent conventional work, building trust, learning the unwritten rules, blending into the culture completely. She made a point of supporting existing initiatives publicly, even while privately questioning their long-term wisdom, patiently building a reputation as competent and reliable before ever spending any of that credibility on a contrarian idea. Only once she'd earned real standing did she start introducing her unconventional ideas, carefully, framed as building on existing practice rather than attacking it. Same opinions, wildly different outcomes, because one of them understood that behavior is a social contract and thought is private property. This isn't about losing your convictions. It's about recognizing that the volume and timing of expressing them matters as much as the content itself, and that credibility is a resource you spend, not something you get to assume you already have. There's a fatigue that comes with this law worth acknowledging honestly. Constantly conforming outwardly while holding different views privately takes real emotional energy, and held too long without ever finding a moment to express what you actually believe, it can quietly erode your own sense of self. The goal isn't permanent silence. It's patient timing, finding the moment your standing has grown enough that the conformity can finally ease. So here's a question worth sitting with. Where in your life are you broadcasting a difference that's costing you influence you haven't earned the standing to spend yet? Blending in protects you, but sometimes to actually gain ground, you need to deliberately create a little disorder. That brings us to Law 39. Stir up waters to catch fish. Have you ever noticed that calm, predictable situations rarely reveal anyone's true intentions, but the moment chaos hits, people's real character and real plans suddenly come into focus? That observation is exactly the mechanism behind Law 39. The principle is uncomfortable, but historically proven. Confusion and disorder aren't always something to avoid. Sometimes they're a tool, because agitation forces people to reveal information, make mistakes, or show their hand in ways calm situations never would. Steady, predictable circumstances let people hide behind careful, rehearsed behavior. Disorder strips that performance away, often faster than months of patient observation could.
One of the most famous examples in modern history is Operation Mincemeat during the Second World War. In 1943, the Allies needed to convince German intelligence that the planned invasion of Sicily was actually a deception and that the real target was Greece. Rather than relying purely on secrecy, British intelligence deliberately planted a fabricated body dressed as a British officer, carrying fake personal letters and forged invasion plans pointing toward Greece, then let it wash ashore in Spain, where they knew German agents would find and examine it.
What made this so effective wasn't simply the false information itself. It was the disorder it created inside German military planning. Instead of one clean, confident assessment of Allied intentions, German command suddenly had conflicting signals, internal disagreements between officers who trusted the discovered documents and those who suspected a trick, and precious weeks lost to debate rather than decisive defensive preparation. The deliberately leaked confusion did exactly what calm secrecy couldn't have. It actively pulled German forces and attention toward the wrong location based on intelligence the Germans believed they'd discovered themselves rather than been told. The invasion of Sicily, when it actually came, met dramatically lighter resistance than it otherwise would have, in large part because manufactured disorder had already done its work weeks earlier, sowing doubt that calm German planning would never have produced on its own.
You see smaller, ethical versions of this principle in negotiation and business constantly. Introducing a surprising new option late in a stalled negotiation to break a deadlock, or a leader deliberately reshuffling team structures, not because the org chart was broken, but because the resulting temporary uncertainty reveals who on the team actually adapts and who quietly panics. There's an obvious danger in this law, too, worth naming plainly. Disorder is hard to control once it's loose. Operation Mincemeat worked because British intelligence had carefully bounded exactly what the Germans would find and exactly what story it told. Stir up chaos without that precision, and it can just as easily expose your own weaknesses as your opponent's, or spiral into damage nobody intended. So here's a thought to carry with you. The next time everything around you feels frustratingly stuck, is there a small, deliberate disruption that might actually reveal the path forward faster than more patience would? Disruption can create opportunity, but not every opportunity that looks free actually is. Let's move into Law 40. Despise the free lunch. Have you ever accepted something that seemed completely free? A favor, a gift, a no-strings-attached offer, and then felt a strange, heavy sense of obligation creep in weeks later, even though nobody ever explicitly asked for anything back? That uneasy feeling is exactly the warning at the heart of Law 40. The principle is simple, even if it feels a little cynical. Almost nothing valuable is truly free. Something given without an explicit price usually carries an implicit one: your gratitude, your loyalty, your future compliance. And that hidden price can end up costing you far more than if you'd simply paid cash up front and kept the relationship clean. Money creates a clean, finished transaction. A gift creates an open, ongoing one. The ancient story of the Trojan horse captures this better than almost anything else in history or legend. After 10 exhausting years besieging Troy, the Greeks appeared to give up and sail away, leaving behind an enormous wooden horse as what looked like a parting gift, a tribute to the gods. The Trojans, thrilled at what seemed like a free, abandoned trophy of their apparent victory, hauled the massive structure inside their own walls and celebrated long into the night. What's worth noticing in the story is that there were voices of caution. At least one figure warned the city not to trust the strange gift, urging them to examine it more carefully or destroy it outright. But 10 years of grinding siege had left the Trojans desperate to believe the war was finally, gloriously over, and that desperation made the gift far too tempting to question closely. Of course, the horse wasn't a gift at all. It was hollow, packed with Greek soldiers who waited until the city slept, then opened the gates from within for the returning army outside. The single most devastating defeat in the entire war came disguised as something Troy got for free, precisely because their guard had dropped the moment the offer looked costless. You don't need a wooden horse to feel this lesson today. Think about the free trial subscription that quietly becomes a recurring charge, the free consulting session that's really a sales pitch wearing a disguise, the generous favor from a colleague who never asks for anything back until suddenly you're the one who can't say no to her request 6 months later.
There's a cost to overdoing this law too, worth being fair about. Treat every gift, every favor, every kindness with suspicion, and you risk becoming closed off, unable to receive genuine generosity when it's actually offered without strings. And you risk insulting the people whose kindness really was just kindness. The skill is discernment, not blanket paranoia. So here's a useful habit to build. The next time something valuable looks completely free, pause and genuinely ask, what is this actually going to cost me later, and am I comfortable paying that price? Knowing what to refuse protects you, but knowing what role you're stepping into matters just as much. Let's go to Law 41. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. Have you ever taken over a role right after someone legendary left it and felt every single comparison stacked against you before you'd even had a chance to prove yourself? That uniquely difficult position is exactly what Law 41 is about. The principle is this. Succeeding a beloved, larger-than-life predecessor is one of the hardest positions in power because anything you do gets measured against a memory rather than against reality. And memory always wins that comparison. It conveniently forgets the predecessor's mistakes and only keeps the highlight reel. The smarter move isn't to imitate your predecessor. It's to redefine the role entirely so you're never compared at all. After Walt Disney died in 1966, the company spent nearly 2 decades struggling under a string of leaders who, understandably, tried to govern by asking, what would Walt have done? The problem was that nobody could actually answer that question the way Walt himself could have, and the studio's creative output grew increasingly stale and cautious as a result, with executives afraid to deviate from a formula nobody alive could fully reconstruct. Every decision got filtered through an impossible standard. Not, is this good, but would this have measured up to a man whose instincts none of them actually possessed? It wasn't until Michael Eisner took over in 1984 that the company truly turned around. And notably, Eisner didn't spend his energy trying to channel Walt Disney's exact creative instincts. He built something adjacent but distinct. Aggressive new business strategy, touchstone pictures for more adult content the original studio never would have made, and expansion into Broadway and cable television. He stopped asking what Walt would have done and started asking what the company could become that Walt never had the chance to build in the first place. He succeeded precisely because he stopped trying to be the second Walt Disney and instead became the first Michael Eisner. This shows up constantly outside of corporate boardrooms too. The coach who replaces a legendary predecessor, the new pastor who follows a beloved founding minister, the employee who takes over a role from someone universally adored. In every case, trying to copy the previous person's exact style is usually a losing game, because the audience already has a perfected, nostalgic version of that style living in their memory, and no living human can outcompete a memory. Carving out a genuinely different lane, where comparison doesn't even apply, tends to work far better. There's a balance worth striking here, though. Rejecting your predecessor's legacy too completely can alienate the people who genuinely loved what came before, and who'll resist you out of loyalty rather than logic. Eisner didn't erase Walt Disney's name or core values. He built new things alongside them. The goal isn't replacing the old man's shoes with no shoes at all. It's lacing up a different pair entirely. So if you're stepping into a role someone admired left behind, ask yourself, am I trying to be a worse copy of them, or am I building something they simply couldn't have built? Avoiding comparison protects you, but sometimes the more direct path to power is removing an obstacle at its actual source. Let's move to Law 42. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter.
Have you ever dealt with a difficult group dynamic? A clique at work, a toxic friend group, a team that resists every change, and exhausted yourself trying to win over every single person individually? Law 42 offers a far more efficient approach. Stop negotiating with the crowd and address the one person actually driving it. The principle is straightforward once you see it. Most troublesome groups aren't actually a unified front. They're held together by one influential individual whose opinions and energy the rest are simply following. Remove or neutralize that one person's influence, and the group's apparent unity often dissolves almost immediately, because it was never really collective will, it was one person's will wearing a crowd's clothing. Most people in a group are quietly relieved to stop performing a consensus they never fully believed in. Think about a manager dealing with a team that constantly resists new initiatives, dragging their feet on every change with what looks like unanimous organic skepticism. If she spends her energy trying to individually convince all 8 team members, she'll likely fail, because most of them aren't actually thinking independently about the resistance. They're following the lead of one senior team member whose quiet eye rolls and skeptical comments set the emotional tone for the whole group before any official meeting even starts. The trap most managers fall into here is treating the resistance as a flat, structural problem, scheduling more all-hands meetings, sending more persuasive emails to the whole group, when the actual problem is concentrated in a single relationship that's never been properly addressed. The moment she has a direct, honest conversation with that one person, addressing his specific concerns, giving him some genuine ownership in the new plan, something remarkable happens. Within days, the broader team's resistance softens dramatically, even though she never spoke to most of them about it directly. The shepherd changed his tone, and the sheep followed, without anyone consciously deciding to. This is why skilled negotiators in labor disputes focus intensely on union leadership rather than every individual worker, and why savvy parents address the one ringleader friend rather than lecturing an entire friend group. Influence in groups is almost never evenly distributed. Find where it's actually concentrated instead of wasting energy treating every voice as equally responsible for the resistance. There's a precision problem worth flagging here too. This only works if you've correctly identified the actual shepherd. Strike at the wrong person, someone who's just loud, not actually influential, and the group's resistance barely shifts while you've burned a relationship and revealed your hand for nothing. The real skill is the diagnosis, not just the action that follows it. So here's a question. In whatever group resistance you're currently facing, who is the actual shepherd, and have you been arguing with the sheep instead? Identifying the real source of influence saves enormous energy. But influence isn't only about identifying leaders, it's also about understanding emotion itself. Let's go to Law 43, work on the hearts and minds of others. Have you ever won an argument completely on facts and logic and still lost the person? They nodded, agreed with every point, and somehow still walked away unmoved, even resentful. That frustrating outcome is exactly why Law 43 exists. Logic can win a debate. It rarely wins a person. The principle is this: Lasting influence is built on emotional connection, not just correct reasoning. People act based on how they feel about you and your idea far more than they act based on whether your argument technically checks out. If you only ever win the logic, you'll find yourself constantly re-winning the same battle because the underlying resentment never actually went anywhere, it just went quiet for a while. Abraham Lincoln understood this with unusual depth for a politician of his era. Rather than simply lecturing rivals and skeptical generals with cold facts about the war effort, he was famous for using personal stories, folksy humor, and genuine warmth even with people who had bitterly opposed him. When dealing with difficult, prideful generals or rival politicians who'd once mocked him, he rarely responded with confrontation or superior logic. He'd often disarm tension with a relevant story or a self-deprecating joke, making the other person feel met as a human being rather than defeated as an opponent. What's especially notable is how often he extended this warmth specifically toward people who had publicly humiliated him or doubted his abilities, rather than reserving it only for allies. Several members of his own cabinet had initially viewed him as an unsophisticated backwoods lawyer unfit for the presidency, and said so openly before he took office. Instead of holding that against them or freezing them out, he kept engaging them with the same patient warmth he extended to everyone, gradually disarming years of skepticism, not through any single brilliant argument, but through the steady accumulation of being treated decently by someone they'd expected to be petty. Many of his fiercest early critics ended up among his most loyal defenders, not because his arguments had crushed theirs, but because his genuine warmth had quietly won their hearts first, and their minds eventually followed. This is the part most people skip when they're trying to influence someone. They perfect the argument and ignore the relationship carrying it. But an idea delivered by someone you trust and feel connected to lands completely differently than the identical idea delivered by someone you feel adversarial toward, even when the words themselves are nearly identical. There's a caution worth adding here, too. Warmth without any real substance underneath eventually reads as manipulation rather than connection. Lincoln's charm worked because his decisions over time proved sound, not just likable. Charm can open the door, but it can't be the only thing standing in the room once people walk through it. So here's something worth asking yourself. The person you most need to persuade right now, have you actually earned their trust, or have you just been stacking up better arguments? Hearts and minds open doors. But there's a subtler tool still. Using someone's own behavior as a mirror to disarm them. Let's move to Law 44, disarm and infuriate with the mirror effect. Have you ever dealt with someone who was needlessly aggressive, manipulative, or condescending toward you and felt that nothing you said seemed to actually land or change their behavior? Law 44 offers a strange but effective answer. Instead of opposing their behavior directly, reflect it back to them. The principle works on a psychological level most people never consciously notice. When you mirror someone's own tone, pace, or tactics back at them, it does two things at once. It can build a strange, unconscious rapport because people feel comfortable around behavior that resembles their own. And when used deliberately against manipulation, it can also expose and unsettle someone because they suddenly see their own tactic reflected back, stripped of its usual effectiveness, with no obvious countermove left to try. Consider a common negotiation scenario. A buyer uses an aggressive tactic, going silent for long stretches, acting visibly unimpressed, implying he has better offers elsewhere, all designed to pressure the seller into nervous concessions. A seller who panics and starts over-explaining or discounting plays directly into that pressure, essentially confirming for the buyer that the tactic is working exactly as planned. but a seller who instead mirrors the exact same composed, unhurried silence, taking her own long pauses, calmly mentioning she has other interested buyers too, refusing to fill the uncomfortable quiet with nervous chatter, completely changes the dynamic. The buyer, who built his entire strategy around being the only calm, unbothered person in the room, suddenly finds himself facing his own tactic, and it rattles him precisely because he can't tell anymore whether it's working. Mirroring removed his advantage simply by removing his exclusivity over the behavior. He came prepared to outweight a nervous seller, and instead found himself sitting across from someone exactly as comfortable with silence as he was. On the relational side, mirroring works gently too, subtly matching someone's speaking pace, posture, or energy in a conversation tends to build unconscious comfort and trust, which is part of why good listeners often feel so easy to be around without anyone quite knowing why. The same underlying mechanism, used warmly instead of defensively, builds connection rather than friction. There's a risk worth flagging in this law too. Mirroring done clumsily, too obviously, reads as mockery rather than rapport, and can escalate a tense situation instead of diffusing it. The effective version is subtle, matched energy, not an exaggerated impression of the other person's behavior performed back at them. So here's a thought experiment. The next time someone uses a tactic on you that makes you uncomfortable, what would happen if, instead of resisting it, you simply reflected it back, calmly and deliberately? The mirror effect works in the moment, but real, lasting power often requires something slower, patiently shifting how people think over time. Let's go to Law 45. Preach the need for change, but never reform too much at once. Have you ever joined a new team, immediately spotted 10 things that needed fixing, changed all 10 in your first month, and then watched the entire group quietly turn against you? That painful overcorrection is exactly the mistake Law 45 helps you avoid. People crave the idea of progress far more than they actually enjoy the experience of disruption. The principle is a careful balancing act. You need to acknowledge that the old way has problems because people respect leaders who recognize what isn't working. But if you actually dismantle everything familiar all at once, you trigger a different, deeper instinct, the fear of losing identity, routine, and control. And that fear turns even reasonable changes into something people resist out of pure self-preservation, regardless of how logical those changes actually are on paper. Think about a new CEO walking into a company with decades of entrenched habits, some genuinely outdated, but many simply familiar and emotionally comforting to long-tenured employees. A CEO who announces in her first week that the entire culture, structure, and process will be overhauled immediately tends to trigger instant organization-wide anxiety. Not necessarily because her ideas are wrong, but because total, sudden change feels like an attack on everyone's sense of competence and belonging. People who spent 15 years mastering the old system suddenly feel like beginners again overnight, and that feeling breeds quiet sabotage far more reliably than it breeds enthusiasm. The far more effective leaders in this position consistently do something slower and smarter. They openly name the need for change to build credibility and trust, then implement it in small, sequential waves, letting each change become the new normal before introducing the next one. They might spend the first quarter simply listening and naming problems publicly without fixing anything yet, which builds enormous goodwill on its own, before ever touching the first structural change. By the time the full transformation is complete, employees often feel like they grew into it together, rather than feeling like it was forced upon them all at once, which is the difference between a workforce that quietly resists you for years and one that actually credits you with the turnaround. This shows up everywhere change happens. In relationships, in habits, in communities. The desire for better is almost universal. The tolerance for sudden upheaval is not. And confusing the two is one of the most common ways well-intentioned reformers fail. There's an opposite failure worth naming too. Pace your changes too slowly, and impatient stakeholders start questioning whether you actually have a plan at all, or whether you're just stalling out of fear. The skill isn't slowness for its own sake. It's matching the pace of change to how much identity and routine is actually at stake for the people living through it. So here's a useful question if you're trying to change something right now. Are you asking people to evolve? Or are you accidentally asking them to lose themselves overnight? Pacing your changes protects momentum, but there's another quieter danger lurking even after you've succeeded, the temptation to look flawless. Let's move to Law 46. Never appear too perfect. Have you ever met someone who seemed to have absolutely everything figured out? The career, the relationship, the body, the bank account, and felt a small, involuntary flicker of resentment toward them, even though they'd never done anything to you personally? That uncomfortable reaction is exactly what Law 46 warns you about. Perfection doesn't inspire admiration nearly as reliably as it inspires quiet envy. The principle here might be the most counterintuitive in the entire book. Looking flawless is actually a liability, not an asset, because it makes other people feel small by comparison, and people who feel small tend to look for reasons to tear you back down to their level, whether consciously or not. Envy rarely announces itself directly. It usually disguises itself as sudden, oddly specific criticism, or quiet exclusion, or a strange eagerness to see you stumble. Consider how differently audiences respond to public figures who occasionally visibly admit a mistake versus those who project relentless flawlessness. A well-known entrepreneur who built a hugely successful company, but who also speaks openly about a humiliating early failure, a product that flopped, a partnership that ended badly because of his own stubbornness, tends to generate far more loyalty and goodwill than a founder who only ever talks about wins. The admission of failure doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes the eventual success feel earned rather than simply lucky or inherited, and it gives the audience permission to root for him rather than quietly resent him. Meanwhile, founders who insist on presenting a flawless image at all times often find that the public takes unusual delight the moment any crack appears, precisely because the perfection itself had been generating unspoken resentment all along, just waiting for an excuse to surface. The fall, when it finally comes, gets celebrated with a kind of glee that's wildly disproportionate to the actual mistake, because the audience wasn't really reacting to the mistake itself. They were releasing years of quietly suppressed irritation at never being shown a single flaw to relate to. The lesson isn't to fake humility or manufacture fake flaws for sympathy. People see through that instantly, and it tends to read as even more calculated than the perfection it was meant to soften. It's simply to stop hiding the real ones. A visible minor flaw or an honest admission of struggle often does more for how people feel about you than another polished achievement ever could. There's a way to misuse this law, too, worth flagging. The flaw you reveal matters enormously. Admitting a quirky personal habit humanizes you. Admitting a flaw that strikes at your core competence, a surgeon admitting shaky hands, or a pilot admitting fear of flying, undermines the exact trust people need to have in you. Choose the flaw you reveal as carefully as you'd choose the achievement you'd brag about.
So here's a question worth considering. Is there somewhere in your life you're working overtime to appear flawless when a little visible humanity would actually serve you better? Avoiding the appearance of perfection protects your relationships. But there's one more discipline left, maybe the hardest of all: knowing exactly when to stop winning. Let's go to Law 47. Do not go past the mark you aimed for. Have you ever been on such a strong winning streak? In a negotiation, an argument, a competition, that you kept pushing past the point where you'd already gotten everything you actually needed and ended up losing far more than you gained? That painful overreach is exactly the trap Law 47 is built to prevent. The principle is deceptively simple, but enormously hard to practice in the heat of victory. Winning has a natural, sufficient stopping point, and the discipline to recognize that point and stop is far rarer and far more valuable than the ability to win in the first place. Momentum has a way of disguising itself as wisdom, convincing you that because the last move worked, the next one will too. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of history's most dramatic illustrations of this exact failure. By 1807, he had already achieved a level of dominance over continental Europe that previous generations of French leaders could barely have imagined. Most of his major rivals defeated or neutralized, France the unquestioned dominant power on the continent. Almost any reasonable strategist would have called that an overwhelming, complete victory worth consolidating and protecting, perhaps for the rest of his life. Napoleon, however, kept pushing. He launched the catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812, marching roughly 500,000 soldiers deep into hostile territory, chasing a victory he didn't actually need, against an enemy that hadn't directly threatened the empire he'd already secured. The brutal Russian winter and scorched earth retreat destroyed the vast majority of that army, turning what should have been an unnecessary side campaign into the single costliest mistake of his entire career. The campaign didn't just fail to add to his power, it fatally weakened the empire he'd already built, and within a few years, the same coalition of enemies he'd previously dominated combined to remove him from power entirely. He didn't lose because his enemies finally got strong enough. He lost because he couldn't stop pushing past victory that was already fully complete. You see smaller versions of this everywhere. The negotiator who wins generous terms and then keeps pushing for one more concession until the other side walks away entirely. The person who wins an argument and then can't resist one more cutting remark that reignites the entire conflict and erases all the goodwill the win had just earned. There's a mirror image mistake worth naming too, though. Stopping too early, leaving real value on the table out of excessive caution, is its own failure. The goal isn't timidity, it's precision. The discipline is hitting exactly the mark you aimed for, neither short of it nor far past it. So here's the question to genuinely sit with. In your current win, however large or small, have you noticed the exact moment you actually achieved what you set out to achieve, or are you still pushing out of pure momentum? Knowing when to stop protects everything you've built. But there's one final law that ties the entire book together, and it's less a rule than a way of existing in the world. Let's close with Law 48. Assume formlessness. Have you ever watched someone get utterly outmaneuvered? Not because they were weaker, but because they were too rigid, too committed to one fixed identity, one fixed plan, one fixed way of doing things, while their opponent simply adapted and flowed around them. That's the final, and in many ways, the deepest lesson of the entire book. Law 48. Assume formlessness. The principle here pulls together almost everything we've covered across both halves of this list.
Power that depends on a single rigid shape, a single identity, a single strategy, a single self-image, is power that can be predicted, targeted, and eventually broken. Power that stays fluid, adaptable, and undefined is power that's almost impossible to pin down, because there's no fixed target to aim at in the first place. Rigidity feels like strength while you're winning, and then becomes the exact reason you eventually lose. Bruce Lee captured this idea with a phrase that's become almost a piece of modern philosophy on its own: the idea of being like water. Water has no fixed shape of its own. Pour it into a cup, and it becomes the cup. Pour it into a river, and it becomes the river. It can be soft and yielding one moment, and with enough force behind it, powerful enough to carve through solid rock the next. Lee developed this philosophy specifically because he'd watched rigid, single-style martial artists get defeated by opponents who simply refused to fight in the way the rigid stylist had trained to expect. What made this especially radical for its time was that Lee was breaking from a tradition that prized exactly the opposite: decades of disciplined commitment to one school, one style, one fixed set of forms treated almost as sacred. He argued that this very devotion became a liability the moment an opponent didn't follow the expected script. The fighter committed to one fixed style could be studied, predicted, and countered by anyone willing to learn that style's weaknesses. The fighter who could flow between styles, who had no fixed form to exploit, was nearly impossible to defeat using a single strategy because there was no single, stable thing to strategize against in the first place. This is really the thread running through every single law we've covered, from recreating yourself all the way through never appearing too perfect. The moment you become too attached to one fixed version of yourself, one rigid plan, one unchangeable identity, you hand the people around you a map of exactly how to predict you, and eventually, how to defeat you. The people who stay genuinely powerful over a lifetime are the ones who never let themselves harden into a single permanent shape, no matter how well that shape happened to serve them yesterday. So here's the final question this entire book leaves you with, not just for today, but for the rest of your life. Which parts of yourself have you let calcify into something fixed, simply out of habit, that might actually serve you better as water? So let's step back for a second, because we just moved through 24 laws. And on their own, some of them might feel like scattered tactics: control the options here, mirror someone there, disappear for a while somewhere else. But if you zoom out far enough, you start to notice they're not actually scattered at all. They're describing one continuous skill viewed from 24 different angles. That skill is awareness. Awareness of how you're perceived. Awareness of what other people actually fear and want underneath their words. And awareness of timing. Knowing the difference between the moment to act and the moment to simply wait. Notice how many of these laws are really just variations on that same theme. Recreating yourself and never appearing too perfect are both about managing perception. Mastering timing and not going past the mark you aimed for are both about restraint at exactly the moment your instincts are screaming to push harder. Discovering someone's thumbscrew and working on hearts and minds are both about recognizing that people are moved by emotion long before they're moved by logic. And underneath all 24 of them sits that final law we just covered: formlessness. Because here's the truth nobody likes to admit: you cannot apply these laws the same way in every situation and expect them to keep working. The friend who responds beautifully to boldness might respond terribly to disdain. The negotiation that calls for spectacle this week might call for quiet patience next week. The moment you treat any single law as a fixed formula, you've already misunderstood the entire book. These aren't recipes.
They're a way of paying closer attention to the room you're actually standing in, instead of the room you assumed you were standing in. If you went through part 1 with us as well, covering the first 24 laws, you'll notice the same thread runs all the way back to the beginning. Never outshining the master, concealing your intentions, guarding your reputation, all of it was really the same invitation we're ending on now. Stay aware. Stay adaptable. Stop assuming the world owes your fixed plans cooperation just because you worked hard on them.
Now, none of this matters if it just stays as an interesting idea you nod along to and then forget by Friday. So let's get concrete. Here are a few things you can genuinely start doing this week. First, pick one relationship in your life right now, a coworker, a family member, a difficult client, and spend real time figuring out their actual thumbscrew, the fear or insecurity underneath their behavior, instead of just reacting to the behavior itself. You'll be amazed how differently a conversation goes once you understand what someone's actually protecting. Second, look honestly at where you've been showing your effort instead of your results. Is there somewhere you could let the work disappear behind the finished product, the way Cary Grant let years of training disappear behind effortless charm? Third, find one place in your life where you've been pushing past a victory you already won. One more concession, one more argument, one more point to prove purely out of momentum rather than necessity. Practice noticing the exact moment enough arrives and stopping there. Fourth, take an honest inventory of which parts of your identity feel like a costume you're still choosing and which parts feel like a cage you inherited and never questioned. You don't need to overhaul your whole life this week. Just notice the difference. That noticing alone changes how you move through the world. And fifth, practice patience on purpose. Pick one thing you've been wanting to rush and deliberately let it sit for a week longer than feels comfortable. Notice what that discomfort actually teaches you about your own urgency. Here's what I want to leave you with. Power, the way this book frames it, isn't really about dominating other people or playing some cold, manipulative game divorced from real human connection. Strip away the historical drama, the kings and generals and ruthless tycoons, and what's actually underneath all 48 laws is something much simpler. A deep, careful attentiveness to how human beings actually work, instead of how we wish they worked. Most of us go through our days reacting on autopilot, saying yes when we mean no, broadcasting our anxiety instead of our calm, chasing approval instead of earning quiet respect. The version of you that's read all the way through this, twice now across 2 parts, has something most people around you simply don't have. You've been handed a map of how influence actually moves through a room, through a negotiation, through a relationship. That awareness doesn't disappear once this video ends. It's already changing how you'll hear your next difficult conversation, how you'll read the next room you walk into, how you'll notice your own desperation creeping the next time you want something a little too visibly. I think about the version of you 6 months from now, having actually practiced even a handful of what we covered today. A little more formless, a little less rigid, a little more aware of the quiet currents running underneath every interaction. That person isn't colder or more calculating. If anything, they're more at peace because they've stopped being blindsided by dynamics they used to walk straight into without seeing them coming. If this 2-part journey through the book gave you something useful, the best thing you can do is hit subscribe, because we've got more deep dives like this one coming, breaking down books that actually change how you move through the world, not just books that sound impressive on a shelf. And if there's a particular law from today that hit a little too close to home, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read through them, and it shapes which books and which laws we dig into next. Until next time, take care of yourself, and go be a little harder to predict.